Welcome to the WARC Podcast. My name's David Tiltman, and today we are talking about some of the fundamentals of marketing effectiveness, including brand and performance, funnels, fragmentation, and, of course, AI. Now, we're joined on this episode by Tom Roach. He's VP at Jellyfish and the mind behind some of the most influential models and frameworks in marketing effectiveness over the past few years. Tom has worked on a whole series of ideas and models that have helped us all understand how marketing is changing and how effectiveness theory needs to keep up. So we decided to do a bit of a retrospective with him. We'll look at some of his greatest hits, where they came from, and the influence they've had, and ask him for his own thinking about how the industry has evolved. Today's episode is also a video podcast, so if that's your thing, be sure to check out the WARC YouTube channel. We'll also show some of the frameworks we're talking about in the podcast as we discuss them. So if you love a good chart, that's the place to get them. So Tom, welcome to the WARC Podcast.
Thanks for having me, David.
So, it might help for people who don't know you just to give a quick intro to you and your background, because I think it's interesting the way you've worked both in what some might see as the more traditional side of the industry and then in a more sort of future-facing part of it.
Yeah. So I am by trade and training a brand or communications or creative strategist, that fat term strategy. And I spent 20-something years in the bigger creative agencies in London. So Abbott Mead Vickers, BBDO, Leah Burnett, BBH London, and then Adam and Eve, DDB. And after those places, I had quite a big shift in 2021, and I went to Jellyfish, which is now part of the Brandtech group. And part of the thing that kind of inspired that move was really a frustration with the separation of brand and performance, a separation of creative and media. And so going to a place like Jellyfish, which does it all, was a really exciting thing for me. Whilst I was on that journey through all those different agencies, I was always doing, wearing a second hat, which was writing effectiveness, often IPA effectiveness case studies, and winning awards for those kinds of things, often for quite big brands like Sainsbury's and McDonald's and Barclays, that kind of thing. And that led to more and more writing. When I was at BBH, they've got a thing called BBH Labs, where I was able to kind of write whatever I wanted about marketing effectiveness, creative effectiveness, that kind of stuff. And that led to things like writing for Marketing Week and my own blog. And so I've always kind of, and also for WARC actually on a few occasions. So I've always kept this kind of second string, I suppose, of exploring what's happening in the world of advertising and creativity, but also marketing more generally, and trying to marry some of the real fundamental principles that are sort of aren't as well known as they should be, the Ritzens, the Burnett and Fields and the Bar and Sharps and all that sort of stuff, with exploring how that kind of thinking can be applied to the present day on real clients. So getting really practical about how it actually all works in today and also into the future.
Well, that segues very nicely into the podcast itself. So what we've done is we've taken 4 of your greatest hits, if you like. And what we're going to do is sort of take each one in turn and kind of have a little look at it, where it came from, what it means, and maybe to some degree how that thinking has evolved over time, particularly as you've delved into it. And I guess one of the joys of coming out with new models is putting it out into the world and sort of seeing how other people take it and adapt it. So the first one is that we're going to look at is something called the performance plateau, which was first developed in 2020, or sort of the initial thinking was in 2020, and then kind of you sort of came back to in 2022. For those watching on the video podcast, we will show the graphic, but I guess just briefly explain to us what that graphic, which some people call like the ramp and bump chart, sought to show, and where that sort of idea or thinking started to come from.
Sure. Well, the first thing to say, this particular one wasn't me alone. It was a partnership with Grace Kite, Dr. Grace Kite, the brilliant econometrician. And actually, she and I have done quite a lot of these kinds of things together. So absolutely have to kind of put her front and center on this one. the chart itself was really an attempt to, and it's funny talking about a piece of PowerPoint. Like
it's not the best podcast material in hindsight.
But I think we were very, very aware when thinking about this, in fact, really we were trying to re-express the work of Les and Pete, Burnett and Field, particularly the long and the short. You can see if you think about their zigzag chart.
Yeah.
We had that in mind, and we were very conscious that is a brilliant expression of the two ways in which marketing communication works, the two timescales it works on. What we wanted to do was to try and find a way to express that in a way that was really gettable and absorbable and understandable to a new kind of digital business. Lots of digital first brands that have probably been maybe skeptical of brand activity, probably grown up through performance marketing activity and had seen really good success with that. And we were also aware that with some of the previous ways of thinking about this kind of stuff, the long and the short can look separate, and they can look like a choice. They can look like an either or. We didn't want it to look like an either or. We wanted to look like a system that you had to deploy together. Hence this expression that has come to be called bothism. Yeah. And we also wanted to show that, and in order to be resonant and relevant with those kinds of businesses for whom it's often not a choice, and it's not a choice to switch off. Sorry, it's not a choice to be able to switch off their performance marketing. That is a given. Yeah, and that's like the base. That's the base layer. Yeah. And if you're a marketer in those kinds of organisations, you'd be looked at like a complete mad person if you went to your CFO or whoever and said, we're going to switch this stuff off, and we're going to pulse it, or we're going to do what looks like switching this activity off, and you'll kind of go back to zero, because that kind of advertising, literally, it's as soon as you switch it off, your sales, a good percentage of your sales will literally just drop away. And at that stage, a brand probably won't have the base sales that brand activity would have kind of built up over time. Yeah. So we wanted to show, basically re-express the Burnett and Field zigzag chart or steps chart in a way that was going to feel resonant to a modern performance marketer, D2C brands and those kinds of things.
So just talk about the plateau itself, because that sort of becomes that the phrase, the performance plateau. Yeah. What are you trying to describe? Through that idea of a plateau? And for people listening, it's a sort of imagine a sales curve going up and then hitting a sort of shelf. Yeah.
So the first phase is this kind of serious growth, which might be viral. It might be then driven by performance activity, and then it's become quite common. And Grace was hearing and seeing in her econometric modeling, and I was seeing from some of the kind of startup or scale up clients that I was working with, that they were often hitting a bit of a plateau where various metrics were they're probably saturated in their performance marketing. Their CPMs may be increasing. Their cost per acquisition might be really increasing, and they're finding it hard to get really more efficient sales. They're probably basically kind of maxed out. So they're looking for new ways to grow, looking for some kind of step change. So often it's funny, on our chart, it looks incredibly flat and placid. It looks fairly sort of, a bit annoying that you've stopped growing. But actually, when you talk to businesses who've suffered from that, it's quite a serious business, and it's quite existential, and they're looking, how the hell are we going to get out of this? We've only got so much runway, or are things going to start dropping off? Where are we going to get our growth from? And they may not have enough funds to continue. So there's a sort of and obviously in that post that point, it all looks rosy, because what we talk about is building in brand investment and getting the short and long term from the brand activity that comes from that, and also this triple whammy effects of having the increased kind of efficiency of your performance activity when you're really getting your brand stuff right. So there's a kind of happy ending, and the story continues, but that sort of pivotal moment in the middle. And when we first created the chart, we were really just talking about the whole model, we hadn't identified actually that was the kind of critical moment. And it was only later that people started saying to us that's actually the bit that's really, really difficult. And so we both started talking about and writing about how brands could really focus on that moment and relearn and rethink their activity. And the way I always think about it is, it really is a kind of an opportunity for your entire communications and kind of brand model to be rethought. And
it's a point of transition for a business.
It's an inflection point. Yeah, absolutely.
Is it interesting, just sort of looking back myself, because around that sort of time, 2021, we were working with James Herman, who developed the model of current demand, future demand, which not just sort of a similar thinking, but really pinpointing these sort of scale-ups, growth businesses as an important audience. And I think it's as much the audience that's interesting as it recognizes that marketing is moving beyond its sort of heartlands.
Yeah, and I think that that audience first perspective, as in there's a whole world of clients and brands out there that are needing to learn this new stuff, was absolutely in our thinking. I remember I think it was in when was it, 2018, I was first kind of experienced this big split. I was invited to go on it was an event called Google Firestarters run by Neil Perkins. And he previously had performance marketing people separate from brand marketing people. And I was like, why would there be a conference which is split in this way? Of course, there are reasons, but it felt, I think that was the point at which I started to go, well, we've got to start bringing these people together so they understand a bit about what they all do. Otherwise, we're all screwed if you've got brand people talking to brand people and performance people talking to performance people. So it was as much a kind of almost an ideological thing of, can't we just bring people together? So I think the sort of philosophy behind it was also it's sort of trying to teach people, trying to help people learn and cross fertilize and cross pollinate.
What do you think's changed since you posted that? Because I mean, it's only last year we ran the multiplier effect at WARC, so it feels like things are moving, but not necessarily that quickly.
Yeah. So do you mean by in this sort of, I guess, the broad space of brand and performance coming together and performance people getting brand?
Yes, exactly. So if part of your goal at that sort of starting point was to bring those worlds together, it feels, I would say it feels like we've made progress since then, but there's still a lot to do.
I think it's really, really hard to identify like what percentage of the marketing world is actually interested in brand versus performance and who's getting the balance right. It's really easy when you're in your own bubble, and we are in a brand bubble, I think, even though I've got a kind of a slight window onto more of those performance type clients. I think it would be easy to imagine there has been a big shift back towards brand. There's a lot of people talking about that in our space.
It really shows up in the spending numbers. The
spends, if you actually look at, I don't know what the percentages are, but it's probably something like 80%, 85, 90% spent on short-term direct response performance type activity and a tiny percentage spent on what's more recognizably brand activity. You'll have the numbers somewhere, but globally, of course, the balance is towards the short term. I suspect it's only when you're really thinking about the really big brands, the really big global kind of marketing companies who are getting the balance right, and they're the ones that are kind of funding the learning with the ROAS Institute and are doing all the right kind of training and that kind of stuff. I think where you do see a really encouraging shift is as it's probably the really big kind of tech platforms and tech brands that have grown and now have quite a sophisticated, mature set of marketers who
it's that new generation brands, like new economy brands, we think we call them. But we had Instacart on stage last year who were, they still have a very, very powerful performance part of their business, and as you say, that's the base layer, that's the stuff that you don't switch off. But they were kind of like a case study in layering on brand on top of that, and then finding the ways that the two things work together. And to see a company that come out of Silicon Valley, with a Silicon Valley mindset, and start to adopt those principles, it's great because it validates the thinking, and all of this learning and knowledge is out there, and these kinds of companies can apply it and they can do really well from it. I still see, can't name names, but enormous brands, really, really famous household names who are like 90% performance based, and their brand teams are small and their brand spend is small, and they're dislocated and disconnected. And you just think, what a wasted opportunity not to connect things up better, and not to have all of it working as one system, one machine. And when you've got, I find it strange, and maybe we'll come on to talking about this with the funnel stuff, but when you've got teams who are labeled after the stages of the funnel, and they're kind of separated in that way, it feels like a mistake. I understand that people have to have their job roles and the tasks and the things they specialize in. But if they're all incentivized differently or called different things and separated and given very different tasks, I fear for how everything is going to work together correctly. Well, that's a great segue onto our second framework, which is the modified funnel from 2021. You've just sort of brought up some of the issues with funnel thinking, but the funnel has been with us for a very long time. It doesn't show any signs of going away. So why do we love the funnel so much in marketing? Yeah.
Why do we love the funnel? Of course, more people have been hating on the funnel generally, but it does seem to stick around. And it's sort of versions of it are sort of, 100 and something years old. I think it sort of first appears in like 1924 or something. I think the reason we love it is it simplifies a complex world. It's just a really, really simple way of thinking about things. In its first iterations, it was really about kind of a teaching aid for salespeople, for like door-to-door salespeople, of how to have a conversation with a prospect, where you lead them, you hook them in, you create some desire, you create more interest by giving them more facts, and then you close the deal. And it really is a sort of mechanistic idea of trying to push people through a sales process in a limited amount of time. What I think happened is that from about 2000 onwards, as the digital platforms develop their ad inventory, essentially Google and Meta, they need really simple ways of selling their ads. They need simple ways of explaining all their inventory and essentially laying it out on a PowerPoint slide. And so they arrange their ad spaces, their formats in a funnel to kind of differentiate different layers, to target different kinds of audiences, different levels of intent. And it sort of sticks as a metaphor. It comes back as a metaphor then. And it's funny, I was talking to Les about this when I was first thinking about the funnel. He hadn't heard of it before I think it was the late 90s.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
He'll correct me on the exact date, but he remembers being in a meeting, a Volkswagen meeting, where a clever planner was using the funnel to organize their thinking. Yeah. And he'd assumed that it was this planner who'd come up with it. Little did he know it was a 100 years old thing. So I think it's just a way of simplifying incredibly complex systems in a way that can then sell people stuff.
So what's wrong with it? Why should we hate on it?
Yeah. So it's as a model, as a simple way of kind of organizing things, it's fine. But actually, when you get into what each of those layers means, and if we're thinking about the really simple version of it, awareness, consideration, conversion, none of those things is quite right. And the fundamental problem is the linearity and this kind of belief that you can somehow organize people, force them through different stages, and you can speak to them as a group of people who are unaware, make them aware, speak to another, or get and then force those people to become considerers of your brand, and then force those people to become converters to your brand. And of course, the world just isn't like that. Everybody has their incredibly kind of, people are ping-ponging around through their, I mean, at this time as well, there was lots of thinking about customer journeys and decision-making journeys and that kind of thing. So there were people creating incredibly complex customer journey maps, which always look fantastic, and they look, I've been in meetings where
enormous sort of things with boxes everywhere and arrows.
At one agency, we used to do them, and there'd be this incredible kind of moment where the scroll, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, were kind of unveiled and stuck on this enormous glossy scroll was stuck on a wall, and everybody kind of looked at it with excitement and a sort of frenzy of, wow, this is going to be incredible. And then when you start getting into the individual bits of detail, people start kind of nodding off a bit.
So you say it's a sort of linearity that, because awareness or making people aware of something is obviously part of the job, and converting people or converting interest into or converting intent into actual purchase is part of the job. It's the bit that's in the middle.
Yeah, the middle's tricky. So the awareness bit, if we go through each layer, I mean, it basically is just it's kind of correct, but it's insufficient. So if you're into the Ehrenberg Bass Institute and mental availability would be their concept that would sit at that level, and is a much more complex thing. It's a kind of combination of things. It's about familiarity with all the brand's distinctive brand assets, the uniqueness of those, the
quickness to mind,
all of that stuff.
In a relevant
salience of for how many category entry points are you associated, how strongly versus your competitors. So there's a whole bunch of things at the top of the funnel which are as important as awareness and are much more specific, hard to measure. Although there are ways. And then the middle is a bit, as you say, is a bit messy. I mean, I think there's way too much kind of store has been set in consideration as a thing. Many categories, you're just there. You fall into the market, and the brands that are available to you mentally, one will be the one that you just edge slightly more towards, and you choose it. So what I did with the funnel was to say, let's call the top bit building. You're building mental availability, you're building associations, you're building your brand assets. Let's call the middle bit nudging, where you're trying to refresh people's memories when they're a bit closer to purchase, just to nudge it up the memory a bit. And you're probably reinforcing and reminding people of the things you've built earlier on. And you're probably adding in a few more hooks to add a bit of consideration where relevant. And maybe giving them a few extra messages that might just tip them over the edge. So much more about kind of nudging people's memories. And then the final bit, it to me is closer to search, which is not really about converting people. It's not actually about, if you think about search and display ads and things where click through is really, really, really low on a banner.
Yeah.
So why would we call some of this advertising that, and there's a lot of it that we see, convert? It's not actually converting people. It's still just doing a kind of reminder job.
It's directional job.
It's really a sort of navigational. It's kind of connecting people to brands they've already decided upon or already favour.
And this is why Byron Sharp thinks that a lot of performance advertising is effectively physical availability. Or
he would say search is really physical availability. He basically believes there's advertising.
Yeah.
All advertising, and then people fall into the market. And then they choose something.
Yeah.
And it's really about building mental availability so that when they fall into the market, you're present in the mind, and then you're easy to find when they're in store, when they're online.
And then the job is directing them to the right place. And it's sort of interesting because it takes, I guess what's missing in that model, and maybe deliberately so, is any sort of attempt at rational persuasion. And I guess that was a sort of deliberate choice.
It was deliberate by me because I felt I don't believe it's always wrong, but I feel like it's overemphasized. It's certainly been overemphasized in some of the pre-testing models. It's a tricky area. I think the thing I'm most persuaded by actually is a replacement for messages is category entry points. So building associations with certain entry points, I think, is probably the thing that replaces message. It's just you've still got to pick some.
Choose the ones
you've still got to pick some. They do end up looking a bit like messages when you're writing your creative briefs. So it becomes a kind of a technical exercise in how you do the job and how you brief creative people to get the answer.
And the thing we always come back to, which is taking the theory and turning it into actual real life messages that people or advertising or whatever it is that people are going to see.
Totally. And I think that's what all of these things are. They're attempts to take kind of theoretical academic stuff and bring it into the real world so that real practitioners have got things that they can use in their work.
Right. Okay. Well, look, let's move on to our third framework, which is bringing us a little bit more up to date. Now, this one, it has become titled Lots of Littles. And this started out, and again, you mentioned Dr. Grace Kite. I think both you and she were working on similar thinking around the same time, sort of late 2024. And then you both brought that to the stage in Cannes as part of our creative impact track at Cannes Lions in 2025. And now this one is a really, it's a hot topic, I guess, since Cannes last year. We've talked about this a lot. We've been asked about this a lot. We know it's sort of top of mind for you as well. If we just go back to the problem that I think you and to some degree Grace were trying to solve back in 2024. What was it? What were you trying to get at? What was the sort of issue that you'd seen?
We probably both had would have come at it from different perspectives. So what I would have been seeing with some of the strategy work we're doing with clients, when you've got a world in which TV is declining in terms of percentage of spend of a big client's overall spend, they're then replacing that largely with, let's call it social. It's broader than social, but social and Google and TikTok. And they've got a much wider range of platforms that they're needing to kind of coordinate. All of those platforms are requiring of them loads and loads and loads of content in a way that in a TV-led world, the TV channels were not saying, give us a new thing every week or every day, or give us 10 things every day. But the platforms do that. And that's because the platforms are, I guess the TV channels could ask brands to do that. They never seem to, or they do it less and less. So you've got a world in which there's just a huge demand for content. And in that world, you as a brand, as an agency team or set of agencies, as a client, there's just a kind of logistical exercise in how the hell are we going to actually make enough stuff? There are bottlenecks in the production and creative process. There's cost implications of that. There's the brand implication for me, which is the most important, because I will always start there, is the fragmentation. How do you make sure it's all aligned? How do you make sure it's all saying, coming from the same place, delivering as many of the distinctive brand assets as you need to be well branded, but not being just brand wallpaper? How do you brief all of those different kinds of creative teams and creative people and influencers and creators that will be part of it? Which is its own kind of challenge, because they're a different kind of creative beast than we've had to deal with before.
I think you used the term, if I remember correctly, in one of your earlier sort of articles about this, creative fragmentation, which is quite a neat way of thinking about it, because when we talk about fragmentation, we often talk about media, and we can sort of understand what that means from a media point of view. But to use the same term about creative, sort of pushed at the problem you're getting at now, where you could be in one channel, but you still need an awful lot of creative styles and treatments.
Yeah, totally. And so, and in fact, I that was the phrase that popped into my mind when I was thinking about this, and I looked on WARC to see if anybody had written about it, because I always like to write new things rather than just regurgitate old stuff, and nobody had. But media fragmentation had been very, very well established. So yeah, it was a kind of equivalent of that idea. And I'd seen that on with specific clients, and we had, in fact, with one particular client, we'd used the phrase big as a collection of smalls, which we'd nicked off BBH from the 80s. So that was a very, very old sort of, BBH, amazing agency, has all these mantras, and that was one of the ones in the archives, I think.
And I think that's a point worth just sort of dwelling on, in that some of these ideas are not necessarily, entirely new thoughts. No. It's sort of things that have maybe bubbled up before in a slightly different context and are suddenly relevant to today.
Yeah, totally. And the big as a collection of smalls, sort of mantra, that was invented in a world where it was basically TV, radio, press, posters. Yeah. So not nearly the number of channels, not nearly the demand for number of executions and assets that we now have. I don't know how many assets a typical brand used to need to make, but nowadays it can be in the thousands. If you're a big multinational with hundreds of brands, you could be making several million things a year, and that is a huge. It requires new things, new ways of thinking, new ways of briefing people, new ways of thinking about brands, new ways of coordinating all of those different strands. And we'd seen this same concept, I think Meta call it multiplicity, the need for multiple, and they talk about systems of ideas, which I also nicked off them. So thinking about not just having one brand campaign, but having individual content strands within different platforms that have connective tissue between them, I think is really important.
And again, the devil here is in the execution. Yeah. It's relatively easy to use terms like systems or platforms or those sorts of things, but actually making them is
completely
is
it's
really
a creative, real creative challenge, and we're kind of in the thick of it. We're working sometimes even with other agencies who don't have the kind of the mechanics, the people, the technology to make all of that stuff happen. We're there making the hundreds of posters or the millions of assets, and of course then you've also got translation, transcreation, adaptation to think about. So there is I don't think I'd have been able to think or write about Lots of Littles if I wasn't working at a place like Jellyfish, because we're dealing at the kind of sharp end of a lot of that stuff. So selfishly, everybody's selling something, right? That concept, I think, does have particular resonance with the kinds of clients we're working with and dealing with in the sort of often in the messy middle. Actually, that's where a lot of this stuff happens.
And I know there's a lot of interest in this, and it feels really sort of current at the moment, at a time when a lot of we've seen big packaged goods companies talk about the amount they're spending in social or on creators. Yeah. It feels like this is an area where this could really evolve in the next couple of years, and we're sort of looking for the model or the idea that brings it all together.
Yeah, I think it probably has come out at this, and is particularly resonant at this time, because it is the big mature advertisers who are now having to grapple with this issue. When I've spoken to kind of social agencies or smaller startup type brands with their own sort of social teams in-house, to them it's just completely obvious. And they're like, why would this even be a thing? Yeah. We know that that's the way the world works. But if you're transitioning from a world where you used to make, 4 big TV commercials, have 4 big campaigns a year, and that was kind of it, transitioning into a world where you've now got to do, and this is obviously a 10, 15 year transition, you've now got to make millions of things. That requires a restructuring your own organization, different teams, different people, different skills, different technology. I think it's important to say at this point, Grace is so important on this thinking, and her the chart that's most resonant for me is her kind of layers chart with the kind of multimedia. It's really a modern version of the multimedia effect, which we've known about for a long time. But I think
generally more channels.
Generally more channels can be helpful. Obviously, there's a limit to that, but she particularly points to the synergy effects of having multiple channels working together. And there's a kind of grey bit at the top, which kind of, I don't know what the percentage is, but let's say it's 30-40% comes from the synergy effects.
Yeah, and Kantar found similar things. I think they've found a big increase in synergy effects.
Exactly, big over similar period, and they've shown that there's not only a big increase, but it just shows that it's really important for brands to lean into the potential opportunity there.
So a couple of questions just to finish this section off. I guess the first is my interpretation of this, and I'm going to see if you agree, is that actually having a very clear creative idea, identity, big brand platform, whatever you want to call it, but having that sort of central organizing principle is more important now than in the past. That actually fragmentation increases the need for, not for centralized control, but for a centralized understanding of what a brand is and how it acts.
Yeah, and there's different language that people use, and I'm not personally settled completely on what that thing is. I've heard the term brand verse being used, which is an interesting one. Obviously, people still talk about North Stars and missions and purposes and those kinds of things, or brand idea might be one. I think probably the most important, there's obviously things about meaning which are really important, and that's kind of idea and message stuff. As important as that stuff is your identity, the visual,
audio,
the distinctive assets, all those things.
Experience.
And those are often the things that are perhaps easier for certain kinds of creators to use, but but then you get into a whole world of what are you expecting creators and influencers to use from this kind of basket of distinctive assets that you're able to give them. The first thing is just to make sure you've got some, because so many brands just don't have the right things in place, and having things which are sonic and stylistic and photographic and cinematic and visual are really, really important.
So final question on this is that we had Les Binet at the IPA conference back in October talking about go big or go home. Now, I suspect there's an entire podcast, or indeed maybe a can session or something that tries to pass this. But how do you go big and do lots of littles, or are they actually sort of fundamentally different?
I think some thinking needs to be done about this. That people it's funny. There have been a couple of different stages where people have wanted me and Les to have a little fight. I'm never going to have a fight with Les on stage. I think it'll be madness. What I would say is there's probably more that unites us than divides us. The things that, the fundamental thing that he was saying actually was budgets are the most important thing. They're the biggest variable. They're one of the biggest variables when it comes to ROI. And so do not reduce your budget. It was really a kind of rallying cry to say you've got to still go big.
Yeah.
The other thing to say is when Grace and I talk about building big from lots of littles, we always say it's still about building big. It is not simply about making lots of little things. You've got to make something big from those things.
Great. Right, let's get on to our final model, which brings us right up to date. And this is what is called share of model. Now, just explain the thinking of this idea and how it relates to earlier concepts like share of voice, and the sort of build on that, which is excess share of voice. Yeah.
Okay. So share of model is a concept that was developed by somebody called Jack Smythe at Brandtech. So again, it's not my idea in any shape or form. I've helped to talk about it and write about it and think about it. And share of model is essentially a brand's visibility and also its perception within the models. So what are the models saying about our brand, and kind of how present in the mind of the models is our brand. So it's akin to brand awareness, akin to brand perception. And And I mean, when I first kind of put something out there about this, I really liked. In fact, when I first heard of it, the thing that I really liked about it was the name. It obviously connects with some of the other share-offs that we're all familiar with. And it when I was thinking about this, I was like, again, with every technological thing that happens, there does seem to be a share of that kind of kicks in as the main thing.
Ultimately about share.
It is about share. It's about competition. Yeah. It's about gaining, increased share of something. So whether it's share of voice, share of the more recent one, share of search, and then share of model, it feels like it's in a sort of, there's a canon of share ofs, which this feels kind of consistent with. I think when I first heard of it, I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if it somehow tallied with or was a predictor of or connected with share of voice or share of search? We don't know that yet. Yeah. I somewhat doubt that it will, because it's constructed quite differently.
Yeah.
But it was a kind of interesting notion at the time.
Because that's, I guess, yes, all these things are interesting share ofs, but they're different in certain, share of voice is about the money you're spending.
Yeah,
within a
exactly. Share of voice is one thing. Share of search is another, and there's various forms of share of search, by the way. That different brand people and performance people will use different definitions of what share of search is. So that's one to be a bit wary of. But share of model is, and with share of model, it's both a concept and a metric, and we've got a platform to help you look at it. It's a fascinating area, and it's become a huge kind of growth area. The whole, it's all wrapped up in the world of GEO actually, and
yes, I mean
which is becoming the thing.
Becoming a thing. And have you done any early research on this? Are you finding any sort of patterns?
So first thing to say is share of model is now in use by many of our clients, and very major household name clients are looking very hard into it. We've done work with INSEAD, which has been published in the Harvard Business Review, looking at the mechanics of it. There was a particular bit that we did with looking at the auto market in the US, and you get interesting things like we plotted human brand awareness versus share of model, so LLM awareness within the auto category, and you could begin to see some differences. So, for example, Rivian had really good LLM awareness, but not so great human awareness. And
what sort of thing might be driving that?
So it implies, obviously, it implies a level of lack of visibility to humans, which potentially is linked quite strongly to its lack of presence on the roads, because that's how it works in automotive. If you've got a big carpool, you'll be seen.
It brings us to a holistic view of what drives brand equity.
Exactly, and for that brand, it suggests that they're more present online. They've found their way into the training data better than they have found their way into into
real life.
And so, and what we're learning about the ways in which, and there is now like an absolute ton of material on this. In this whole world, but we're learning about what gets you into the training data, and what obviously there's part of it which is getting into the search data, because often the LLMs are doing a search whilst they're also looking into their training data to give you answers, whether that's an AI overview or a more of a conversational session that you're having. And so that's really about credibility and authority and being seen as a really authoritative brand voice within the data. So looks like Rivian are doing some things right in that case. And what we're able to do with share of model is look at each model and your share of voice within each model. And so you can see, okay, well, if we're doing really well with ChatGPT but not so well with Gemini, that may suggest that we need to be creating better, more attuned content for YouTube, which is obviously being
it's a part of Alphabet,
and viewed by them. So it can point you in certain directions about the kind of content you need to create, and the kinds of and the insights we're getting from what your brand perception is. So it gives you strengths and weaknesses. So we can look at the kind of meaning and message you need to create content about. So it's an early, it's a new area. It's developing all the time. The tool and the platform is developing all the time, but it's becoming a very, very useful tool. As our SEO people transition into being GEO people, it's a tool that they're using.
And I guess just to bring us right back full circle to the first model we were talking about, do you think this sort of gives us a new visibility on brand in its broadest sense, that a sort of a company can have a visibility that sort of beyond what it might expect for its resources or something like that? Does this give us a new way of thinking about brand?
It's tricky if you start getting into thinking it's a completely new thing, because most purchase is still going to be mediated by humans. We don't know how important agentic kind of buying is going to be. There's debate about the extent to which agents are going to be actually used. Are we going to completely devolve responsibility to agents who will be, of course, consuming all sorts of content that's designed for probably made by AI for them. And you can even imagine a world in which there are brands that are completely created for them that are almost invisible to humans. That's a weird world. But I think that we're seeing more and more people, and I've talked about this kind of dual purpose communication. So creating content for humans, which drives mental availability, thinking about if and how that content and communication can impact the LLMs. So if you think about the importance of Reddit, it's one that keeps coming up again and again. Reddit seems to be very, very present in the training data. Imagine a campaign that's able to create conversation in Reddit. You can then impact LLM visibility and perception of your brand a bit more directly than in certain other types of platform, and that can have an impact on both human and agentic brand choice. So you've got a world where the LLMs are an audience that we need to consider, and you'd be mad, I think, as a marketer not to be thinking about that as an important audience these days. And we already know that we've got many brands that are reporting, particularly in B2B, reporting that they're getting traffic direct from LLMs, and LLMs are kind of essentially sending people their way. We're doing more research. We've got something with Kantar and INSEAD again to look at if we already know what the drivers of creative effectiveness are with humans, what are the drivers of creative effectiveness with the LLMs? What are the differences between those two sets of things? What are the similarities? What's the Venn diagram, essentially? We're kind of TBC on that right now, but it's an interesting one.
Well, that sounds like a good tease for what's coming up. And Tom, thank you. It's been really, really interesting to talk through those four models. And interestingly, there's only 5 or so years in between them, but it feels just in the way we've talked through them, it feels like that's almost sort of tracking the fast pace of change within the industry. We've gone from sort of DTC, the need to engage DTCs, right up to the need to engage agents in a few short models. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's all we have time for on today's episode. A huge thanks to Tom for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like more information on the ideas we've discussed today, well, head over to WARC.com. We've got plenty for you. Until next time, thanks for listening, or indeed for watching.